Anybody want to get in on this? And
Terence?
Yeah.
Sometimes when I'm listening to you, I have sort of the troubling thought that I think Terence hasn't done enough psychedelics, or I think that you're too straight in some way. And it's when you get onto some of your scientific tracks, and as you put it, you're a rationalist, I start thinking, why get lost? And I start thinking, I start referring to experiences I have had of being altered, where a lot of this seems incidental to the experience, say, of one experience of eternity, or which I know you've had. And how do you reckon with yourself sometimes, and think, when you say doubt yourself and think this is just my ego concocting things to make me feel good, and et cetera, whatever would be the worst case scenario for you. It's hard for me to express this sort of well, but there's something about when you're the way that you often refer to a sort of what seems to be a scientific model that is very linear, even as you talk,
Well, I would certainly agree that I haven't taken enough psychedelics. Reading these people, it seems like, I doubt these guys are real psychedelic heads, and they're much further out than I am. The real truth is, and I've said it many times, that the world is not only stranger than we suppose, it's stranger than we can suppose. And in a way, that's either permission to suppose anything you want, or to just stop supposing, These things are models. Nowhere is it writ large that bipedal apes should be able to understand how the universe works. Still less likely is it written anywhere that Terence McKenna should be able to understand how the universe works. Were you here the other night when we talked about the black hole theory of enlightenment? It was 2 nights ago.
I was here, right?
Yeah. Well, that's the idea that the real truth can't be told. I'm very aware that all of this is just stuff to support me, to make a living, in other words. That in fact what's really going on defies rational apprehension. I hope. I would hate to think that we could understand what's going on. Nevertheless, there's something to be said for this modeling process. And I agree, I think I'm getting old. You can only push yourself so far. When I read one of these things today, and he was off on some tear, and I just realized, it struck fear in my heart. And I said, my God. And I actually did a mirror on the wall, who's the weirdest one of all? And it said, Hans Moravec is the weirdest one of all. I said, shit, what am I, I should bring him here and sit at his feet. I don't know, am I talking about what you're talking about? Oh, good.
I find a fantastic parallel between the psychedelic experience and physics. I haven't found anything in the psychedelic experience that would be any problem to relate to from the point of view of a physicist. And actually, I think that all this stuff in physics got out of the bag because of the psychedelic, breakthroughs in the 60s. Fritjof Capra and others had psychedelic experiences and then started to ferret it out from... in 1920s, people were puzzling about these things and having the spiritual crises and throwing away all of their assumptions about reality and having these types of breakthroughs, and then it got lost because we started to bag physics to use for the military. And it was only with an environment that opened up because of the psychedelics that it would come out.
But I don't think that that the purpose of science is to understand reality. This may go to what you're saying. I think the purpose of science is to advance technology, which is a heresy. I don't think reality can be understood, and that it's absolute hubris for science to, cloak itself in the mantle of philosophy. All it's for is to make better toys, or if you're nuts, better weapons. And ultimately, there's not going to be any closure in the effort to understand. And I think that the thing that you take away from psychedelics finally is that all models are provisional, that there is no truth. We talked at one point in here about Wittgenstein's phrase, true enough. True enough. True enough to get you to the gas station, true enough to get your taxes paid. But there'll be no closure on this stuff. We have to live in the light of the mystery. But I think we also said in here, it's the death of conversation if we glorify the mystery too much, because then, I'll be just like everybody else here and I'll announce that we're now going to have a meditation, which I've never done to you, I want to point out. Somebody wanted to say
something. Well, with that in mind, I wonder how you can project an end to eternity at a certain time.
Well, I didn't mean to imply a nothingness beyond. It isn't like that. I think it's an everythingness. That when I talk about what I envision it as boundary dissolution, if all boundaries dissolve, then, I am you and you are me and we are all together. It's a exfoliation of the human experience. I mean, the great boundaries are, the small boundaries are man, woman, self, world, and then the big boundaries are life, death, past, future. All of these will be dissolved into something like William Blake's divine imagination. And we will become, our grandest dreams. And so the whole challenge is to dream a dream worthy of that dimension. I mean, it's a very interesting exercise. I don't know if you've ever done it. God, it comes close to being a visualization, I'm sorry to notice. But have you ever played the game, what would I do if I could do anything? First of all, you have to wrap your mind around the concept, anything. What would I do if I could do anything? And I used to think about it in terms, for some reason for me it takes the form of an architectural fantasy. First of all, I just locate myself in the house featured in last month's Architectural Digest. Then from there I would begin to work it out. Well, if you could do anything within a few minutes of entering into that exercise, you're unrecognizable to yourself. I mean, you don't even have to exist in a forward-flowing casuistry of 3 dimensions. You can be a number of species, and all possible sexes. You can be translocated at many points in time. You begin to realize that you are tremendously limited by your assumptions, and that and this is sort of what I imagine death is. its release into the divine imagination. And if you're blown up in an airliner or something, then immediately after dying, you're just a dead person. But then you begin to unfold and test the boundaries. And, as James Joyce says in Finnegan's Wake, up nient, prospector, you sprout all your worth and woof your wings. And that's just in the first 30 seconds that you woof your wings. And then you are able to to divide your consciousness, to assume any form, to be any place, to know anything. Anything recognizable as human, I think, would quickly drop away, or would just become a tiny and familiar touchstone that you would occasionally return to touch. And somehow the dying, which occurs to each one of us, that's the microcosm of the planetary and historical process that we're caught up in. It's the thing that we hate most of all. We fear it. We really get agitated when death is raised as an issue. James Joyce called it the Grim Reaper, a blessing in disguise. If you want to be phoenixed, come and be parked. Meaning, you have to die to fully exfoliate into this dimension. And sometimes I think, and I don't often say it to groups because I fear I'm misunderstood and I don't want people to go out of here depressed, but sometimes I think that what human history pushes for is the extermination of all life on the planet, for the simple reason that we'll never be free till then. That we are in some kind of hell world, and we are locked in a world of matter and energy and space and time, and that it is not, my God, this sounds like, Southern Baptists, but we are living death at this moment, and that we must die in order to be born again. In other words, that somehow what we are has become trapped in a lower dimensional matrix, and our greatest delusion is to cling to this most tenaciously. Jorge Luis Borges, in one of his stories, has this idea that the species, any species, is somehow not completed in eternity until the last member of that species dies. And it is interesting that if you think about biology, 95% of all species that have ever lived on this planet are extinct. This is what happens to species, is they go extinct. And yet, we're driven to pursue immortality. It pains us greatly to imagine the death of all life on this planet, and particularly the death of our individual selves or our species. But the fact of the matter is, we don't know what death is. One of the puzzling things about the DMT trance is, these creatures made of light in the mind that are so different from us but have such affection and love for us, they seem like relatives. They seem like, dare we whisper the word, they seem like ancestors. And yet, we would rather believe that they were aliens from Zeta Reticuli or elves in a parallel continuum than apply Occam's razor to the phenomenon and say, since we are the only intelligent entities that we have ever contacted in this universe, these things which we contact in our minds in the center of the DMT flash, they must be human beings of some sort. But they don't look like human beings. But they love us so much and understand us so well. Well, is it possible that the kind of human being they are is a dead human being? that we're actually breaking through into an ecology of souls. I mean, if we say that the psychedelic experience is an experience of boundary dissolution, and if we say that DMT is the strongest of all psychedelics, then may it not be that it is dissolving the most resistant of all barriers, which is the barrier between the living and the dead, and that what you actually come into is the antechambers of eternity for a brief glimpse. If you were to take that rap and properly translate it into Witoto or Muinani or something like that, and go to the Amazon and query those folks, they'd say, well, of course. I mean, your own Merciliade tells you that shamanism depends on the spirit ancestors. And for all the credit we give shamanism, we've never actually come to grips with the possibility that shamans really do work with the spirit ancestors, that there really is an ecology of transmaterial human beings in a nearby continuum that can be approached by a boundary dissolving drug. And it's because, we, and certainly I, and certainly proven by this rap tonight, are obsessed with technological explanations of it and how it's going to be the flying saucers, it's going to be the time machine, or the collapse of the quantum vector, or something like that. But because the forward thrust of our technology is toward immortality. I mean, that's what's gnawing at the back of our minds. And yet what may actually be coming toward us, orthogonal, meaning at right angles to the historical process, is the dissolving of the barrier between the living and the dead, which is so unsettling and mind-boggling to us that we'd take a flying saucer invasion any day over having that happen to us. And yet it's very, very late in the game. Human nature is going to have to undergo a radical, vertical translation of some sort if we are to avoid the extinction of ourselves and all life on the planet. Well, so then, maybe that's what it was for. If we believe that we were always embedded in the machinery of nature, that we could never act outside the purposes of nature, then this must be what it's for. It's very interesting in embryology. I think most people think, of a fetus in the womb. As you all know, we begin as very fish-like creatures in the womb, and then out of what are essentially little paddle mitts, the human hand appears. And I think most people think that the tissue retracts tightly and that the human being emerges. But if you've seen fetal stages in bottles in medical schools, what's actually going on is that cells die off. A massive amount of dying goes on in the womb in order that the human form may emerge out of the fetal form. The webbing between the fingers doesn't retract. Those cells die and are released into the amniotic fluid. The growth of the fetus involves the death of millions and millions and millions of cells. So we are born. We are, you could almost say, sculpted into life by the hand of death. I feel as nervous about all this as you must. But, this is what we're here for, right? To stretch the envelope. Yeah.
Terence, I would like to go back to something that you said about the beings of light and the shamanic capacity to see and to interact with these beings, and they could be the ancestors. Thinking in terms of those individuals who refined their senses to being able to see more than the average ability to see, and to be able to hear more than just the normal ability to hear, where there's a growing awareness of almost like interpenetrating planes of beings that are actually coexisting with us, but we just can't hear them or see them because we haven't refined those senses enough. And the more psychically sensitive individuals have an increasing ability in a non-drug state to be aware. It's just they could see more and hear more. And I haven't heard you say that.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's a very good point. The perfect example of it in terms of a cultural tradition is fairyland. Fairyland is the pre-Christian Celtic peoples believed that dead souls stayed around in the immediate vicinity, and that there were thousands of them all around, the accumulated dead, very much in the way that when you smoke DMT, then there are thousands of these things, and it raises the question, were they always there, or what's going on? St. Patrick, who brought Christianity to Ireland, found this belief. And also, Anita makes the point about sensitivity. In Irish folklore, there's the idea that if you have the eye, you can see these things, and no drugs are required. It's a psychic ability, which the country Celtic people have sometimes claimed. So when Patrick came to Ireland on his mission of conversion, he found this belief in fairyland so powerfully entrenched in these people that he invented purgatory. Purgatory was invented by St. Patrick to convert the Irish. And then when word was carried back to Rome that Patrick, who was this great bishop of the early church, that he had made this doctrinal concession to Celtic folk thinking, the Pope thought it was such a fine idea that they just wrote it into dogma. So purgatory, which, as you all know, is neither heaven nor hell, but a place where you expiate your sins for some amount of time before you pass on to heaven, is nothing less than a cleaned-up version of fairyland written into Christian theology. Now, I don't know why the Celtic people would have not a monopoly, but a firm grip on this. I mean, it may be their innate gloominess, their obsession with death, their it's called the agenbite of Inuit. It's that we just chew on ourselves till we dissolve, but there was something about that character that set it up for perceiving these entities. Although in all traditions all over the world, if you dig deep enough, you can usually find a tradition of small people that live in the hills or under the hills, meaning graves, right, under the hills, and they are the ancestors. And the best that straight folklorists can tell is they have some weird law that as a people recedes into time, they shrink, which seems to me preposterous. I mean, I just don't understand that. I think that the evidence is pretty good that this is going on. The fact that DMT is a naturally occurring neurotransmitter is very suggestive. Rupert Sheldrake has made the suggestion that dying is a unique chemical experience, and he calls DMT a necrotic hallucinogen. That you actually, if you are truly dying, your brain will be flooded with DMT, and then you will see the ecology of souls waiting to receive you. I once questioned a very well-known Tibetan teacher about what was going on in DMT, and he said, yes, these are the lesser lights He said, you can't, if you go further than that, you will break the thread of connection and be unable to return. And so, I think this is the most challenging idea to us on the conscious and unconscious level, because we may, I'm only speaking for myself, but it seems to me true that we really have, at a profound level, accepted the scientific lie that death is non-entity, and it gives us, it's a permanently weakening idea, because it makes us each such a finite being. It means that no matter what you do, eventually, it will all end in the cold, cold ground. Always at my back I hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. This coyness, lady, would be no crime had we but world enough and time. The grave's a lovely private place, but none do there, I think, embrace. Well, maybe Andrew Marvell was wrong. Maybe there's more fun on the other side than you might wish to be congealed. Anybody, save me from myself.
I'm wondering, I have the impression what comes to mind is a world that you project where everybody is schizophrenic, so that today I can be Napoleon, tomorrow Jesus, and I can meet somebody else who also believes that he is Napoleon, Jesus, Buddha, or whatever, and back and forth in time. I'm just wondering what kind of a place that's going to be.
Well, I would buy into that. I think schizophrenia is the absence of cultural expectation. In the most profound sense. The casuistry doesn't even apply. I consider myself schizophrenic, and I have observed schizophrenia in other members of my family close up in great detail. And what it is it's simply the breakdown of casuistry. And then ordinary people, imprisoned in the hallucination of culture, language, and linear time, lock you up and put you away because you're reporting from outside the cultural envelope and carrying information that terrifies, alarms, disturbs, and just you drive other people crazy is what it is. I'm talking now about process schizophrenia, which is the spectacular kind where you bring back information that is absolutely incommiserate with the models of your culture. No, I think it's been said that the world is becoming more schizophrenic. Well, that's just because they didn't have the word psychedelic. A psychedelic experience is essentially a kind of schizophrenia, and the people who in the early phase of psychedelic research, they wanted to call it a psychotomimetic, meaning it mimics psychosis. It doesn't mimic psychosis, it's a schizomimetic of some sort. Psychosis is a whole different pathology. But schizophrenia is simply a category for behavior and insight that the rest of society is unable to do anything with, I think. Yeah, no, that doesn't trouble me at all. I like talking about how I'm schizophrenic. Maybe this answers your criticism that I'm linear and running down and old. I can always go nuts. If all else fails, you can go bananas, I suppose. The schizophrenics return with the great aesthetic visions and the scientific breakthroughs and the poetic understandings. And it's almost as though they have been aided by the demon artificers. They have taken into their retinue supernatural helpers. And a shaman would say, of course, allies. And I'm sure you all know the way in which schizophrenia and shamanism map together. I mean, our own Julian Silverman is the great pioneer in the one-to-one mapping of shamanism and schizophrenia. And years ago, when I was completely bananas, every time they would approach from 3 sides with nets, I had Julian's paper called Shamanism and Schizophrenia, and I could quote it chapter and verse and back them off because what is called the initiatory crisis in shamanism is nothing more than a schizophrenic break with ordinary reality. The problem is we freak out completely and rush to drug people and give them electroshock and tie them down and slap them around. Well, so then the unfolding of the process is interrupted, and it's as though you were to, perform surgery on a fetus or something and then be amazed when it turns out a monstrosity. When if you would just have left it alone, for crying out loud, it was unfolding along its own creodes of morphological development. This is why people like R.D. Laing seem to me to be the ones who thought most deeply and correctly about schizophrenia. To become schizophrenic is a wonderful opportunity. The trick is to make sure that you're nowhere where straight people can get at you. And my schizophrenic episode occurred in the Amazon basin, and it was 5 days march to just a mission. And I've always felt that evading modern mental health care facilities saved my mind. Absolutely. And in a traditional society, it's supported. If someone shows signs because they're dreamy or they hallucinate or they're epileptic or something like that, then this is encouraged and they're put under the care of shamans, and drugs are used to initiate the crisis in some cases. And it's a cause for great rejoicing to have these personalities because in the culture, because they're the antennas for the culture that are contacting the raw stuff of real being and transducing it down into cultural artifacts and institutions that then are useful. Anything else?
Grandfather paradox.
Oh yeah, what did you want to say?
I don't think. Your idea of the endpoint makes perfect sense to me, and I don't think the grandfather paradox is an objection. It's not really a paradox.
No, I don't think it's a paradox.
I mean, it's a self-consistent universe. You're here, so you didn't kill you. If you killed your grandfather, you wouldn't be here to ask the question.
I think that's the way to handle that. I think when we finally really understand time travel, we may find out that it's common as dirt and has been going on all around us in all kinds of physical processes.
Make up stories. I mean, the human mind likes to make up stories. So, if you came back and killed your grandfather and you're still here, then we'd have to make up a story. Like somebody else got into your grandmother. Your grandfather or something like that. So,
but since that isn't how it works.
Well, it may be working that way. I mean, people disappear mysteriously, and all sorts of things happen, and we just fit them into a framework that makes sense to us. And when we're in a realm of time travel, then maybe we'll have to reinterpret all that weird stuff that occurred in history.
That's an excellent point. That. All kinds of stuff goes on around us that may be, in fact, the collapse of paradoxical situations that we don't understand, like, all these well-documented cases of spontaneous human combustion and stuff like that. I mean, unless you just flat out deny that this goes on, which is a kind of cop-out, I think, because it just means you don't believe large bodies of evidence. I mean, not everything weird that's claimed goes on. But on the other hand, I don't think God is a Republican. I think there's plenty of weird shit flying around. And as I said, nowhere is it writ that anthropoid apes should understand reality. And every culture that's ever existed has operated under the illusion that it understood 95% of reality and that the other 5% would be delivered in the next 18 months. And from Egypt forward, they've been running around believing they had a perfect grip on things. And yet we look back at every society that preceded us with great smugness at how naive they all were. Well, it never occurs to us then that maybe we're whistling in the dark too. That the universe is stranger than you can suppose. And that openness, that perception imparts is a great joy, a great blessing, because then you can live your life not in service to some fascistic metaphor, but in service to the living mystery. The fact that you're not going to understand it. It is not going to yield to logic or magic or any other technique that's been developed. It's bigger. You know, the novelist John Crowley has this wonderful aphorism: the further in you go, the bigger it gets. And I think this is true of most things. That's all, folks. We got through another one of these. Okay, thank you all for coming. I do not understand why you put up with this, but I appreciate it. I do appreciate it.